My sister-in-law spent 2 years chipping away at my marriage like water working a crack in a foundation. Patient, quiet, relentless, until the whole thing finally gave way. In the end, it wasn't even her voice that broke us. It was my husband's. He was the one who said the word out loud, sitting at our dinner table with a napkin still tucked into his collar, like he was ordering dessert instead of ending 8 years of my life. He didn't ask for a divorce. He asked for an annulment. He actually believed, in that smug, freshly Googled way certain men believe things, that an annulment would let him walk away clean. No house, no shared accounts, no obligation. Like the marriage had simply never happened. Like I had simply never happened. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. 3 days later, I canceled the $2,400 automatic transfer that had been quietly leaving my checking account every month for 4 years to cover his nephew's tuition at a private school in Westchester. I canceled the payments on his sister's car insurance. I canceled the streaming subscriptions, the gym membership I'd been paying for his mother, the recurring grocery delivery that somehow always included his sister's favorite brand of coffee, even though she didn't live with us anymore. Officially, anyway. I didn't do it out of spite. I want to be honest about that because spite is loud, and this wasn't loud. This was quiet math. I simply stopped paying for a family that had spent years telling me I didn't belong to it. But to understand why I could do that so easily, without my hands shaking, without a single second of hesitation, you have to go back to the night it all cracked open. You have to sit at that table with me. You have to smell the pot roast. I'd been on my feet for almost 2 hours that evening, moving between the stove and the counter in our Murray Hill apartment. The kind of apartment that photographs beautifully and cooks terribly, with a galley kitchen too narrow for 2 people to pass each other without turning sideways. I made a beef pot roast with a dark, glossy gravy, roasted fingerling potatoes, green beans with garlic and lemon, and, because I always did, because I'd been trained to without ever agreeing to the training, a tray of honey-glazed chicken thighs, my nephew Caleb's favorite. Caleb was 9. He was Brianna's son, my sister-in-law's boy, and whenever he came over, he asked for that chicken like it was owed to him, and somewhere along the way I'd stopped questioning why I always said yes. The smell of hot oil kept catching in my throat that night. Not unpleasantly, exactly, just persistently. The way a smell can suddenly feel 3 times stronger than it used to. I'd noticed it for about a week and a half. Coffee smelled wrong. My favorite perfume smelled wrong. I chalked it up to stress because stress was the explanation I reached for automatically in that apartment, the way other people reach for allergies or a change in the weather. I had a secret that night, and it was a good one. The kind you carry around all day like a warm stone in your pocket, taking it out every so often just to look at it. 10 days earlier, I'd sat in a paper gown at my OB/GYN's office on East 34th Street and watched a small flickering shape on a black and white screen. 6 weeks. A strong heartbeat, the doctor said, everything measuring exactly where it should be. After 3 years of trying, after 2 losses I still couldn't talk about without my throat closing, after appointments and supplements and a fertility specialist we'd gone to see twice before Derek decided we couldn't afford it anymore, after all of it, there was finally a heartbeat. I hadn't told Derek yet. I wanted one night, just one, that belonged only to the 2 of us before it became something his mother had opinions about, something his sister could somehow make about herself. I set the table with the good plates, the wedding china we never used, and I put a candle in the center even though it was a Tuesday, and I planned the whole evening in my head on the walk to the pharmacy and back. Dinner first, the good wine for him and sparkling water for me that he wouldn't think twice about, and then, once the plates were cleared, I'd take his hand and tell him he was going to be a father. That was the plan right up until 5:40, when I heard a key turn in the lock that wasn't Derek's. Brianna let herself in. She'd had a key to our apartment for 2 years, ever since her divorce. Ever since the 6-week stay that became a 6-month stay that eventually just became an unspoken permanent arrangement she maintained from her own place 3 blocks away, dropping by so often it hardly mattered that she'd technically moved out. She kicked off her sandals in the middle of the entryway, dropped her bag on my reading chair, and flopped onto the couch with Caleb trailing behind her, already glued to a tablet. She turned on some influencer's unboxing video at a volume that made the walls of the apartment feel too thin, and within minutes, my mother-in-law Diane arrived behind them because Brianna had apparently texted her that dinner was happening, an invitation nobody had extended to her, and one she'd extended to herself on my behalf. Diane sat at my dining table, ran one finger along the edge of it, and made a small sound of disapproval. "Still a little sticky here," she said to no one in particular. Then, glancing toward the corner of the room, added, "Brianna mentioned there was dust over there last time. I don't know how you keep up with a place this size." I said nothing. I'd learned that silence cost less than defending myself. I checked my phone. 5:45. Derek usually walked in around 6, still in his blazer, smelling like the little bit of cologne he reapplied before leaving the office because he said it made him feel put together for the commute home. He was 36 that year, a vice president at an asset management firm in Midtown, the kind of job that came with a corner view he liked mentioning and a bonus structure he liked mentioning even more. To everyone who met him, Derek was proof that hard work paid off. To his mother, he was proof of something bigger, that she had raised at least one child correctly. At 6 exactly, the door opened. Derek came in, hung his coat on the hook, and before he'd even said hello to me, Brianna was up off the couch and following him toward the bathroom, where he went to wash his hands, her voice pitched low and wounded in that particular register she reserved for complaints about me. "I'm so glad you're finally home," I heard her say through the half-open door. "Your wife's been ordering things online again. 3 boxes today. I don't know where she thinks the money's coming from." I hadn't ordered 3 boxes of anything reckless. I'd ordered prenatal vitamins, a body pillow, and 2 books about first trimesters, all with money from the small freelance graphic design business I ran on the side, the one nobody in that apartment seemed to remember existed whenever it was convenient for them to forget it. Derek came out of the bathroom with his jaw already tight. "What did you buy?" he asked. Not hello, not how was your day, just an accusation dressed up as a question. I almost told him. I had the words right there, lined up and ready. Nothing extravagant, Derek. Just things for the baby. But Brianna was standing behind him with her arms crossed and a look on her face like she already knew something I hadn't told anyone yet. And Diane was watching me over the rim of her wine glass, waiting. And something in me just closed like a fist. "Some necessities," I said instead. "What necessities come in 3 boxes?" Brianna laughed, that short, sharp laugh she used like a slap. "You don't even work a real job. Your closet's already full of clothes you never wear. Must be nice." I looked at her for a long moment. Something had shifted in me over the last 10 days, something I couldn't fully name yet, and it made me say, calmly, "It's my own money, Brianna." The table went silent, the way a room goes silent right before a storm breaks a window. "Did everyone hear that?" Brianna said, turning to her mother, her voice climbing. "She eats my brother's food, lives in my brother's apartment, and she's talking about her own money like she doesn't owe this family anything." Diane set down her fork with the exaggerated care of someone performing patience. Naomi, honey, marriage isn't a ledger. When you're married, there's no his money and her money. There's only our money. You should feel lucky you get to be part of taking care of this family. I looked at Derek. I wanted one sentence from him, just one. Something like, she doesn't need to justify herself. Or, actually, Naomi's covered most of our expenses for years. Which was true. Painfully, quietly true. The tutoring for Caleb, the copay on Diane's cholesterol medication, half of Brianna's car insurance since her divorce, the streaming services everyone used and nobody else paid for. I had covered it all, without complaint, for years, because I believed, the way you believe things when you're 28 and in love and desperate to be liked by the family you married into, that this was what being a good wife looked like. Derek looked back at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Cold. Distant. Already halfway out the door of our marriage. If you're going to keep score like that, he said, maybe we should just get an annulment. I actually laughed, one short, disbelieving breath, because for a second I thought he was joking, that he'd misspoken, that he meant divorce and just used the wrong word out of anger. But he didn't correct himself. He said it again, quieter, more deliberate the second time, like he'd been rehearsing it. An annulment, Naomi. Like this marriage never happened. Caleb, oblivious, reached across the table and grabbed a chicken thigh with his bare hand. Brianna smirked. I saw it, quick and small, gone before anyone else could catch it. Diane went back to sorting rice on her plate as if nothing at all had just happened in her presence. As if her son hadn't just tried to erase 8 years of a woman's life at a dinner table she'd helped set the mood for. I stared at Derek. I thought about the boy who used to wait outside my dorm at 7 a.m. with warm bread rolls from the bakery 2 blocks from campus because he knew I skipped breakfast when I was stressed about exams. I thought about the fight I'd had with my own parents, who begged me not to move to New York with a boy from a different world than ours, who worried out loud that I'd end up small in a marriage that made him bigger. I thought about how I'd left a stable job back home and packed my whole life into 2 suitcases because I believed, with the total, humiliating certainty of a 26-year-old in love, that this man would choose me every single time it mattered. He wasn't choosing me. He hadn't been choosing me for a long time. I had just been too busy cooking his nephew's favorite chicken to notice. An annulment, then, I said, my voice so calm it startled even me. Sure, Derek blinked. Whatever reaction he'd expected, tears, begging, a scene, this wasn't it. And I watched something flicker across his face that looked almost like fear. I stood up, walked to the kitchen counter where I'd left my phone charging, and unlocked it. I pulled up my order history and set it on the table in front of him, the way you'd lay down a winning hand of cards. Look closely, I said. Prenatal vitamins, a pregnancy pillow, 2 books on the first trimester. I'm 6 weeks pregnant, Derek. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. Derek's face went the color of the tablecloth. His mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out of it. Brianna recovered first, because Brianna always recovered first. It was practically her one true talent. Impossible, she snapped. She's lying to keep you from leaving. Every time there's talk of you two splitting up, suddenly she's got some announcement. Convenient, isn't it? Brianna, Derek said, but there wasn't much force behind it, and I heard the doubt sitting right underneath his sister's name like a stone under running water. Diane set her wineglass down with a small, precise click. Her voice, when it came, was soft in the way a blade is soft right before it isn't. If you're really pregnant, that is wonderful news, Naomi. But don't you dare use a baby to manipulate my son. I actually laughed again, and this time it came out sharper than I meant it to. In the entire time since I'd walked in the door with that phone held out like evidence, not one person at that table had asked if I was okay. Nobody had asked if the baby was healthy, if I'd been to the doctor, if I needed to sit down. My pregnancy, the thing I'd cried about with joy on the sidewalk outside my OB's office, the thing I'd planned an entire quiet evening around, had already been filed in real time under the category of things Naomi does to get her way. "I'm not lying," I said, sliding my phone back into my pocket. "And you're right, Derek. Let's get the annulment." "What are you talking about?" Derek's brow furrowed, some of the coldness cracking into confusion. "If we're ending this, why would you keep the baby?" "Because it's not the baby's fault," I said. "I'll raise this child myself if I have to." The room went silent again, and then Brianna's laugh sliced through it, high and delighted, like I'd just handed her exactly the ammunition she'd been waiting years to use. "Wonderful. Go back to your parents' place upstate and play house with your baby then. Just don't come crawling back here begging for anything once you realize how hard it is out there without my brother's paycheck." I didn't argue. There was nothing left in me that wanted to argue. I walked past all of them into the bedroom, took the suitcase down from the top of the closet, and packed with a strange, floating calm, a few changes of clothes, my laptop, my passport and social security card, the folder of medical records from my OB, and a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother, one of the only things in that apartment that had ever really been mine. 8 years of marriage, and it took me 11 minutes to pack everything I couldn't bear to leave behind. When I dragged the suitcase back through the living room, nobody moved to stop me. Brianna was picking the last piece of chicken off the serving tray. Caleb was slurping a soda through a straw, eyes back on his tablet. Diane was finishing her wine like she was at a dinner party that had simply run a little long. Derek was sitting on the arm of the couch with his head in his hands, and even then, even watching his back curve under the weight of what he'd just done, some old, loyal part of me hoped he'd stand up and say, "Wait." He didn't. I stopped at the door to put my shoes on. Brianna watched me the whole time, arms crossed, triumphant. "You're going to regret this, Brianna," I said. Not with anger, just with a strange, tired certainty. "One day." She smiled. "Regret losing the person who paid all my bills? I'll survive." I didn't answer that. I opened the door and I left. It wasn't until I was standing alone in the elevator, watching the numbers count down, that I noticed my hands were shaking. I called a car from the lobby and asked to be taken to the Port Authority. And on the way there, I texted Derek 4 words. "Send the papers here." Then, after a pause, my thumbs moving before I'd fully decided to let them, I added one more line. "And by the way, Caleb's spring tuition installment is due next Friday. It's $6,200. I've paid it every semester for the last 4 years. That's your family's responsibility now." He replied almost instantly. "What are you talking about?" I locked my phone and pressed my forehead against the cold window of the car, watching Midtown slide by in a smear of light. I didn't cry then. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect the tears to come the second the door closes behind you. And for me, they didn't. The tears came almost 2 hours later, on a bus rolling north out of the city, once the skyline had shrunk down to nothing behind me, and there was nothing left to perform strength for. I cried quietly into my scarf, while the woman next to me pretended not to notice, and I realized, somewhere around exit 15, that I wasn't crying because I still hoped for anything. I was crying because I finally understood that for 8 years I hadn't been building a marriage. I'd been running a boarding house, and I was the only one who'd ever paid rent. The bus pulled into the small terminal outside my hometown a little after 11 that night. The air smelled like wet asphalt and cut grass, the specific smell of a town so much smaller than the one I'd just left that I'd forgotten it existed. My parents were waiting on the platform, my mother in a cardigan 2 sizes too big for her, clutching her purse strap with both hands the way she did when she was nervous. My father standing a little behind her, silent, his hair grayer than I remembered from Thanksgiving. My mother's eyes went from my face to my suitcase to my stomach in the space of about 2 seconds, and something in her expression told me she already understood most of it before I said a word. She crossed the platform and put both hands on my face. "You're home," she said. That was all. Not what happened, not "I told you so," not "Are you sure about this?" Just, "You're home." And her hands were warm and shaking slightly, and I nearly went to pieces right there under the fluorescent lights of a bus terminal I hadn't stood in for 6 years. My father took my suitcase without a word and carried it to the car. On the drive back through streets I still knew by heart, the bakery on the corner that used to sell cinnamon rolls the size of dinner plates, the elementary school with the chain-link fence I used to climb, the trees at the entrance to our old subdivision grown so much taller now that their branches brushed the roof of the car. I felt something loosen in my chest for the first time in what felt like years. My mother reached back and took my hand from the front seat, holding it the way she used to when I was small and scared of thunderstorms. "Did something happen with Derek?" she finally asked, gently, like she was diffusing something. "We're getting an annulment, Mom," I said. My voice barely made it out of my throat. "I'm 6 weeks pregnant. If he doesn't want this baby, I'll raise it myself." The car went so quiet, I could hear the wipers ticking against a light drizzle that had started somewhere along the highway. My father's shoulders tightened, just slightly, but he didn't say anything, didn't turn around, didn't slow the car in shock the way I half expected him to. He just kept driving, steady, and after a long moment he said, in a voice thick with something I hadn't heard from him since my grandmother's funeral, "Thank God you came home. We'll figure the rest out together." I put my head down and let the tears fall onto the back of my own hand. I had braced myself the whole ride for an "I told you so." My parents had never liked how quickly Derek and I moved to New York together, had never fully warmed to the idea of a son-in-law who called twice a year and only when it was convenient. But there was none of it, not one word of blame. And that mercy, offered so simply, so completely without conditions, undid me more than any argument could have. My old bedroom hadn't changed. The floral curtains, the desk under the window, the paperback novels from high school still sitting unfinished on the shelf where I'd left them. My mother had already made up the bed with clean sheets, and on the nightstand she'd set a glass of water and a small plate of crackers, like she'd known I was coming before I did. "Cry tomorrow if you need to," she said from the doorway. "Talk if you want to talk. Tonight, just sleep." I slept harder than I had in months. I woke up the next morning to sunlight cutting through the same floral curtains I'd fallen asleep looking at as a teenager, and for one soft, disoriented second, I forgot where I was and why. Then it all came back at once, the way it does, like a wave you thought had already passed breaking over you a second time. My mother was already in the kitchen, moving through her usual routine. Coffee, eggs, the radio turned down low to the local news station she'd listened to every morning of my childhood. My father was in the backyard doing something to the gutters that didn't strictly need doing, the way men do when they need somewhere to put their hands and their worry. Neither of them asked me anything over breakfast. My mother just refilled my water glass twice and put an extra egg on my plate without comment, and I understood that this was their way of taking care of me, not with questions, but with eggs. By 10 that morning, my phone had lit up 11 times. 6 missed calls from Brianna, 3 from Diane, 2 texts from Derek that I didn't open right away. When I finally did read Brianna's messages, they were exactly what I expected. Accusations that I was selfish, that I ran home to my parents at the first sign of conflict, that I deliberately humiliated the family by bringing up Caleb's tuition in front of everyone, as though I was the one who'd invented the arrangement, rather than simply refusing to keep funding it in silence forever. Diane's message was gentler in tone, and somehow crueler in substance. A woman's strength is shown in how much she can hold together, Naomi. Think of the stress you're causing everyone with this, especially with a baby coming. You're tearing this family apart over money. I read it twice, sitting at my parents' kitchen table with my hands wrapped around a mug of decaf, and I noticed, almost with surprise, that the words had lost their old power over me. 6 months ago, that message would have sent me into an apology spiral, drafting and redrafting a response until it satisfied everyone but me. That morning, I just set the phone face down on the table and finished my coffee. At around 11, a courier rang the doorbell with an overnight envelope from a law office in Manhattan. Inside was a petition. Derek was formally filing for an annulment, not a divorce, and attached to it was a proposed settlement he wanted me to sign, quietly, quickly, before things went any further. The terms were almost breathtaking in their audacity. I would vacate the apartment. I would waive any claim to property acquired during the marriage. I would receive no spousal support. There would be no accounting whatsoever for the money I'd contributed to the household over 8 years. The tuition, the insurance, the groceries, the small mountain of receipts I'd never once asked him to reimburse because I believed, foolishly, that a marriage didn't run on ledgers. And buried in a single vague clause near the bottom, regarding our unborn child, was this: matters concerning any child shall be addressed by mutual agreement at a future date. My father read it over my shoulder, and I watched his jaw tighten in a way I hadn't seen since I was 16 and came home an hour past curfew with a boy he didn't approve of driving the car. "What does he think you are, Naomi?" he said quietly. I didn't have an answer for that. I just knew that whatever Derek believed an annulment would give him, a clean erasure, a legal reset button on 8 years of my life, the law probably wasn't going to be quite as generous to him as he was hoping. That same afternoon, I called a lawyer. My college roommate's older sister practiced family law in Poughkeepsie, and within 2 hours I had an appointment for the following morning with an attorney named Patricia Reyes. Patricia Reyes's office was small and unglamorous, tucked above a dry cleaner on Main Street, with a window unit that rattled every few minutes, and a framed law degree slightly crooked on the wall. She was in her 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up onto her head, and she had the kind of gaze that made you feel like she'd already read your entire situation before you opened your mouth. She read Derek's proposed settlement twice, in total silence, tapping one finger against the desk. When she finally looked up, there was something sharp and almost amused in her expression. "He's trying to get you to sign away your rights before anyone even files this properly," she said. "That's not how annulments work, and honestly, I don't think it's how he thinks they work either. Someone's given him bad information, or he's given himself bad information because it's convenient. She explained it to me slowly, patiently, the way you'd explain something to someone who'd spent 8 years being told her opinions weren't worth much. An annulment, in our state, required specific legal grounds: fraud, bigamy, a marriage entered into under duress, one party being underage at the time. None of that applied to us. We'd been legally, willingly married for 8 years, and the mere fact that a husband had grown tired of his wife, or had been persuaded by his sister that his wife was a financial burden, was not grounds for an annulment under any interpretation of the law. If anything, she said, filing on those grounds and losing, which he almost certainly would only slow things down and cost him money and legal fees for nothing. More importantly, she said, sliding a legal pad toward herself and starting to write, even if by some miracle a court did grant an annulment, that doesn't erase child support obligations. It doesn't erase parentage. A child conceived and born during a marriage, even one that gets annulled after the fact, is still legally his child, and he is still legally responsible for that child. He can call it whatever he wants. The law doesn't care what he calls it. I felt something in my chest unclench slightly, some fear I hadn't fully let myself name until she said it out loud. And the money, I said. Everything I paid for. His sister's insurance, his nephew's tuition, groceries, all of it. Do you have records? I hesitated for exactly 1 second before reaching into my bag and pulling out a small external hard drive I'd packed almost without thinking, tucked between my passport and my grandmother's jewelry box, like some part of me had known for a long time that this day might come. I have 3 years of them, I said. Patricia Reyes raised an eyebrow, plugged the drive into her laptop, and began scrolling. Bank statements showing recurring transfers to Diane's account. Screenshots of texts where Brianna asked to borrow money that was never repaid. Dozens of them, spanning years. Receipts for Caleb's tuition, all paid from my personal freelance account, none from any joint account Derek could later claim as marital funds spent mutually. A message from Brianna sent 18 months earlier that I'd screenshotted on instinct at the time without fully understanding why. You've got savings just sitting there doing nothing anyway. Might as well use it on someone who actually needs it. How long have you been keeping all this? Patricia asked, not looking up from the screen. Since the first time Brianna told Derek I was just freeloading off his family, I said. I wasn't planning to sue anyone. I just wanted proof, in case he ever actually asked me for it. I never thought I'd need this much of it. She looked up at me then, something warmer moving across her face. Well, Naomi, we're not going to use this for revenge. We're going to use it to make sure you leave this marriage with exactly what's yours, not less. I nodded, and for the first time since that dinner table 3 days earlier, I felt something that wasn't grief. It felt almost like the beginning of ground under my feet. That evening, back at my parents' kitchen table, I opened my banking app and started canceling things. It felt strange at first, almost illicit, my thumb hovering over each recurring payment like I was disarming something. The $6,200 tuition installment for Caleb's private school, due that Friday. The one I'd covered every single semester for 4 years without ever once being thanked for it. Canceled. The $340 a month toward Diane's supplemental health insurance premium, a cost Derek had once told me his mother couldn't manage on her own, conveniently never mentioning that she received a pension and owned her condo outright. Canceled. Brianna's car insurance, $190 a month, which I'd started paying 2 years earlier during what was supposed to be a temporary rough patch after her divorce, and which had simply never stopped. Canceled. The streaming services, the grocery delivery subscription that always somehow included Brianna's oat milk and Caleb's specific brand of fruit snacks. The payment I made toward Derek's mother's cell phone plan. All of it, one after another, gone. I didn't feel triumphant doing it. I want to be honest about that, too. I felt, more than anything, a strange grief. The particular grief of realizing how much of yourself you'd poured into people who would have let you drown without noticing the water was rising. My phone buzzed less than an hour later. A text from Derek. "What did you do? The school called my office about Caleb's tuition. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that is for me?" I stared at that message for a long moment, sitting there at my parents' table with my mother across from me shelling peas into a bowl, pretending not to listen, and my father in the next room with the television low. "Paying for your sister's son's private school was never my obligation," I wrote back. "I did it because I chose to, as family, out of goodwill. That goodwill is gone now. It's your responsibility." He didn't reply right away. I imagined him doing the math in his head. Years of tuition, insurance premiums, groceries, subscriptions, all of it added up in his mind for maybe the first time. The actual dollar figure of what he'd let his wife absorb without ever once offering to split it or even properly thank her for it. My mother set down her bowl of peas and reached across the table to squeeze my hand, once, without a word. That night she came into my room with a glass of warm milk, the way she used to when I was small and couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed my hair back from my forehead. "I'm not scared of you getting an annulment, Naomi," she said quietly. "What scared me was watching you shrink for 8 years because you were afraid of what people would say if you finally stopped." I leaned my head against her shoulder, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel like I was carrying the entire weight of a family that had never once carried me. 2 weeks into the process, Patricia asked me to pull a full credit report as part of preparing our financial disclosures. It was standard procedure, she said, a formality, nothing that would take more than a few minutes to review. It took me considerably longer than a few minutes, sitting alone at the kitchen table with my laptop, to understand what I was actually looking at. There, buried among the mortgage and the 2 credit cards Derek and I had opened together early in our marriage, was a personal loan I had never applied for. $41,000, opened 14 months earlier, under a joint account that used my name, my social security number, and, I discovered after a horrified 20 minutes of digging through old emails, a signature that was almost, but not quite, mine. I called Patricia the next morning with my hands shaking so badly I had to set the phone down on the counter and put her on speaker. "I never signed for this," I told her. "I don't even remember a bank representative calling about a loan. I would remember something like that." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet lawyers go when they're already 3 steps ahead of you. "Naomi, do you have access to the apartment's shared computer, or any device Brianna might have used while she was living with you?" I did. Derek had never bothered changing the passwords on our home desktop after Brianna's temporary stay technically ended, mostly because she still came by often enough that it hadn't seemed worth the hassle. I drove back into the city that weekend. My father insisted on coming with me, sitting silently in the passenger seat the whole way down the Taconic like a bodyguard who didn't need to say anything to be effective. And while Derek was at work, I let myself into the apartment I still technically had a legal right to access, and I copied the browser history and download folder from that old desktop onto a flash drive. It took Patricia's paralegal 3 days to piece it together. Brianna had used the shared computer on a date 14 months earlier when I remembered being away for a work conference to fill out an online application for a personal loan in both our names, listing our joint address, and had apparently forged my signature on the digital consent form well enough that the automated system hadn't flagged it. The money had been dispersed directly to an account in her name. She'd used it, according to the transaction history Patricia's office was later able to subpoena, to pay off her own credit card debt and put a down payment on a car. I sat with that information for a full day before I could even process what it meant. Not just that I'd been carrying her family's bills willingly for years out of misguided loyalty. That was a wound I understood, one I'd chosen, however foolishly. This was different. This was theft. This was my name, my credit, my future, quietly mortgaged by a woman who'd sat at my dinner table 2 weeks earlier and called me selfish for spending my own money on my own pregnancy. "This changes everything," Patricia told me, and for the first time since I'd walked into her office, I heard something like real anger in her voice on my behalf. "This isn't just a messy divorce anymore, Naomi. This is fraud, and it happened in a home your husband was legally responsible for as well, whether or not he had any idea it was happening." I thought about Derek sitting on the arm of the couch that last night, head in his hands, saying nothing as I packed. I wondered, not for the first time, whether he really hadn't known, or whether not knowing had simply been easier for him than the alternative. He showed up at my parents' house on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced, standing on the porch in the same gray coat he'd worn the night everything ended, looking smaller somehow than he had in our apartment, like the city had shrunk him down to a size that fit better out here in the daylight. My father answered the door first and simply stood there, arms crossed, not inviting him in, not telling him to leave, just waiting to see what I wanted to do. I came up behind him and told him it was fine, that I'd talked to Derek on the porch, and my father retreated only as far as the front window, where I could see the curtain twitch every few minutes for the entire conversation. Derek looked tired, genuinely tired, not performing it, and for a moment the old reflex in me, the one trained over 8 years to comfort him first and ask questions later, nearly won out. I caught myself before it did. "I found out about the loan," he said, before I could say anything at all. "Patricia's office sent something to my lawyer. Naomi, I swear to you, I had no idea Brianna did that. I would never have let that happen." "I believe you didn't know," I said, and I meant it. "But you also never asked how any of it was getting paid for. Not once, in 8 years, did you ask where the money for your nephew's tuition came from, or wonder why your sister's insurance was never a topic at dinner. You just let it happen, Derek, because it was convenient for it to happen. And now you're standing on my parents' porch acting shocked that convenience had a cost." He didn't argue with that. He looked out at the yard for a long moment, at my father's carefully mowed grass, at the old swing set still standing crooked in the corner where it had stood since I was 7 years old. "I panicked," he finally said. "At dinner, when you told me you were pregnant, I panicked. And Brianna and my mother were right there, and I said the worst possible thing I could have said. I know an annulment doesn't even make sense. My own lawyer told me that 2 days after I filed. I just wanted an easy way out, and I grabbed for the first word that sounded like one. You wanted to erase me," I said. "That's what you actually wanted. Not just out of the marriage, out of the 8 years, like none of it counted." He didn't deny it, and somehow the honesty of his silence hurt more than a denial would have. "I'm sorry," he said eventually. "I know that doesn't fix anything." "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." I told him, standing on that porch with my hand resting on the small, still flat curve of my stomach, that I was withdrawing my agreement to any settlement that waived my rights, that Patricia would be filing a proper response, contesting both the annulment and his proposed terms, and that, given what had happened with the loan, we would also be pursuing the matter separately, whether or not it affected him personally. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," I said. "I'm doing this because for 8 years I made myself smaller so your family could feel bigger. And I'm not doing that anymore. Not for you. Not for this baby's future." He nodded slowly, and something in his face, not quite grief, not quite relief, something in between, told me he understood, maybe for the first time, that this wasn't a fight he could talk his way out of the way he usually talked his way out of things. Before he left, he asked, quietly, almost like he was afraid of the answer, whether he'd be allowed to be part of the baby's life. "That has nothing to do with any of this," I told him. "You'll always be this child's father. What kind of father you choose to be is entirely up to you, starting now." He drove away a few minutes later, and I stood on the porch for a long time after his car disappeared around the corner, feeling the strange, hollow quiet of an ending that had finally, fully arrived. The formal proceedings took 4 months. Patricia withdrew Derek's annulment petition on procedural grounds within the first few weeks, as she'd predicted. His own attorney had already advised him it had no chance of succeeding. And the case converted to a standard divorce, complicated significantly by the discovery of the fraudulent loan, which Patricia's office pursued as a separate civil matter against Brianna directly, with Derek named as a co-signer by virtue of the joint account status, regardless of his claimed ignorance. I sat through 2 mediation sessions in a beige conference room in White Plains, across a table from Derek and his attorney, while Patricia laid out, item by item, exactly what 8 years of my labor and money had built and subsidized in that marriage. The apartment's down payment, to which I'd contributed nearly 40% from savings I'd brought into the marriage. The retirement contributions I'd made consistently, while Derek's had lapsed for 2 years during a stretch when he was focused on other investments. The freelance income I'd funneled quietly into groceries, insurance, tuition, subscriptions, year after year, while telling myself it didn't matter whose name was on what, because we were supposed to be a team. Derek's attorney tried, briefly, to argue that much of what I'd paid for constituted voluntary gifts to family members rather than marital contributions subject to division. And Patricia calmly slid across the table 3 years of documented bank transfers, alongside a single screenshot of Brianna's message about my savings just sitting there doing nothing. The room went quiet. Derek's attorney didn't raise that argument again. By the end of the second session, we'd reached terms. I would receive a settlement reflecting a fair division of marital assets, including a portion of the apartment's equity. Derek would provide child support calculated according to state guidelines once the baby was born, along with covering the medical costs of the pregnancy that weren't handled by my insurance. And, separately, in the civil suit against Brianna, a judge would eventually order her to repay the fraudulent loan in full, with Derek's attorney making it very clear, in a private conversation I wasn't present for, but heard about later, that if she didn't, Derek intended to let the consequences of that fall entirely on her, rather than absorb them himself. Which apparently caused the first real rupture between Derek and his mother in longer than anyone could remember. I didn't feel joy signing those papers. I felt something quieter and sturdier than joy. Something closer to being handed back a version of myself I loaned out for 8 years without ever expecting repayment. I spent the first weeks after the papers were finalized simply resting, in a way I hadn't let myself rest in years. My mother kept up her usual routines around me, cooking, gardening, occasionally asking, with real gentleness, how I was feeling that day. My father, quieter by nature, showed his care in smaller ways, a glass of water left on my nightstand every morning without a word about it, the porch light left on for me even when I wasn't planning to go anywhere. A month or so in, I started thinking seriously about work. I'd kept my small freelance design business alive through everything, but I knew I couldn't build a stable life for a child on inconsistent client checks alone, and I didn't want to go back to the corporate design job I'd left years earlier, the one with the fluorescent lighting and the rigid 9 to 5 that had never quite fit me even before New York. One morning over breakfast, almost before I'd fully thought it through myself, I told my parents I wanted to start a small business, home-cooked meals made to order, catering for small events, built around the kind of food I'd spent 8 years cooking for people who never once said thank you. Except this time, cooked for people who actually wanted it. My mother looked surprised, then quietly pleased. My father just asked one question. "Have you thought it through?" "Not entirely," I admitted. "But I think if I wait until I have a perfect plan, I'll wait forever." He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was deciding to trust someone's judgment, even against his own instinct toward caution. "Then finish what you start," he said. "Don't leave it half done." I spent the following weeks researching suppliers, pricing out a small commercial kitchen space above the hardware store 2 blocks from Main Street, calculating margins with a level of care I'd never once applied to my own finances during my marriage. Because for the first time in years, the numbers I was protecting were entirely mine to protect. A family friend, a man named Owen who'd grown up 2 houses down from mine and now ran a small organic produce distributor out near Rhinebeck, started stopping by more often than the produce contract strictly required. He never pushed, never made it about anything other than what it was. Friendship, steady and undemanding, offered without an agenda I could detect. One afternoon, while we stood in the empty rental space I was considering, surrounded by dusty shelving and the smell of old wood, he asked me, out of nowhere, if I was scared. "Of what?" I asked. "Of it not working." I thought about that for a moment, one hand resting on the growing curve of my stomach. "Of course I'm scared," I said finally. "But I'm more scared of not trying. I spent 8 years scared of the wrong things." He nodded, like that answer made complete sense to him, and didn't push any further. By my 7th month, I was heavier and slower than I'd ever been in my life, and also, strangely, stronger. I kept working through the final preparations for the business, a small storefront I'd decided to call Heart Table, using my maiden name, Hart, which felt like reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd missed until I got it back. My father drove me back and forth to the space every day that I couldn't manage the short walk comfortably, and my mother started arriving in the late afternoons with containers of food, just in case, until half of what I was technically supposed to be selling had actually been cooked by her. Owen showed up more and more, always with some reasonable excuse, a supplier contract that needed a signature, a delivery he was already in the area for, a folding table he thought I might need. I began to look forward to those visits in a way that surprised me. Not with the breathless urgency of new romance, but with something calmer, something that felt more like being seen than being wanted, which, after everything, was what I actually needed. Derek called occasionally during those months, and I answered more often than not, because whatever else had broken between us, I understood he would always be this child's father, and I didn't want our daughter. The 20-week ultrasound had told us it was a girl, growing up with parents who couldn't manage a civil phone call. One evening, he called to ask, hesitantly, if he could help with anything for the business. Equipment, a loan he'd pay no interest on, anything. "That offer's about 4 months too late," I told him, not unkindly, just honestly. "I don't need it, but thank you for asking." He was quiet for a moment. I know my apologies don't mean much anymore, he finally said. But I am sorry, Naomi, for all of it. For not standing up for you at that table. For every dinner before that one where I let my mother and Brianna talk about you like you weren't sitting right there. I didn't argue with him, and I didn't forgive him out loud either, because I wasn't sure yet that I fully had, and I didn't want to hand him a piece I hadn't actually made. I just said, okay, and let the conversation end there, gently, without either of us needing to force it into something bigger than it was. When I hung up, I noticed something I hadn't in months. My heart didn't race. It didn't ache. It just settled, quiet and steady, the way water settles once you stop stirring it. Heart Table opened on a bright Saturday in early spring, with far less fanfare than I imagined my mother-in-law would have insisted on if she'd been the one throwing the party. I didn't want a grand opening. I invited my parents, a handful of close friends from high school who'd stuck around town, and Owen, who arrived an hour early to help me hang the small hand-painted sign my father had made, Heart Table, in simple black letters, with a small painted heart tucked into the corner of the T. It looks great, Owen said, standing back to admire it, hands on his hips, a smear of white paint still on his forearm from helping. That night, after the last guest had gone home and my parents had headed back to their house with promises to return the next morning to help with the first full day of orders, I sat alone in the small dining space, the yellow overhead lights humming softly, the smell of fresh paint and rosemary still hanging in the air. I put my hand on my belly, round and full and impossible to ignore now, and I whispered, "Mommy did it, sweet girl." She kicked, once, firm and certain, right under my palm, and I laughed out loud in the empty room, tears running down my face that had nothing to do with sadness at all. The road ahead was still uncertain in 100 practical ways. Whether the business would survive its first hard winter, whether I could manage a newborn and a fledgling storefront at the same time, whether I'd ever fully trust another person the way I'd once trusted Derek. But sitting there, alone in a space that was entirely mine, built with my own hands and my own money and no one else's permission, I understood that I wasn't afraid of any of it the way I would have been a year earlier. I had proof now, real proof, that I could survive things I never thought I'd survive, and build things I never thought I'd have the nerve to build. Labor started 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with a low ache across my back that I mistook for having slept wrong until it sharpened into something unmistakable by mid-morning. My mother moved through the house with the calm efficiency of someone who'd apparently been quietly preparing for this exact moment for months, gathering the hospital bag I'd packed weeks earlier, while my father brought the car around without needing to be told twice. The delivery room in the small regional hospital wasn't glamorous. Fluorescent lights, a window overlooking the parking lot, a nurse who'd gone to my high school 2 years ahead of me and recognized me the moment I was wheeled in. But none of that mattered once things got hard. Once the pain narrowed the whole world down to a single point of effort, my mother's hand gripped so tightly in mine I probably left marks. My father pacing somewhere out in the hallway, because he said afterward he couldn't bear to watch and couldn't bear to leave either. When I heard her first cry, thin, furious, entirely her own, something in my chest cracked open in the best possible way. "A healthy girl," the doctor said, laying her, small and red and impossibly perfect, on my chest. I looked down at her tiny face, scrunched and outraged at the sudden brightness of the world, and every hard month that had led to this one seemed, in that instant, completely worth it. My mother was crying openly beside the bed. "You did it, honey," she kept saying, over and over, like she needed to say it enough times for it to feel real. I named her Grace. I wanted her life to be full of exactly what her name promised. Ease where mine had been hard. Softness where mine had been sharp. Even though I knew, better than most, that life rarely hands you a straight path toward the things you name your hopes after. I wanted the name anyway. I wanted to give her a word to grow into. The weeks after Grace was born folded into each other in the particular blur that new mothers everywhere seem to recognize instantly, and everyone else forgets almost as fast as they lived through it themselves. Feedings every few hours, my mother taking over nearly all the housework so I could focus entirely on the baby and the few hours of sleep I could manage to steal. My father, gruff and unpracticed with infants, discovering an unexpected gentleness in himself, walking Grace around the living room for an hour at a time so I could shower in peace. A month in, I started easing back into the business, a few hours a day at first, Grace napping in a bassinet behind the counter, while I filled small catering orders and slowly rebuilt the rhythm of the place. Owen came by often, sometimes with fruit for me, sometimes with nothing more than an offer to hold Grace for 20 minutes so I could get through a batch of orders with both hands free. "She looks just like you," he told me one afternoon, Grace asleep against his shoulder, one small fist curled near his collar. "I hope she doesn't get my old temperament," I said, half joking. "The one that let people walk all over her for years." He looked at me for a long moment, something steady and warm in his expression. "If she ends up with the temperament you've got now," he said, "that'd be a pretty good thing to inherit." I didn't have a response for that, not right away, but I felt it settle somewhere in my chest and stay there. Derek visited twice in those first months, awkward and overly careful, holding Grace like she might shatter, clearly still working out what kind of father he wanted to be now that the answer wasn't handed to him automatically by circumstance. I let him visit. I answered his calls about scheduling without friction. I didn't make it harder than it needed to be, because whatever damage he'd done to me, Grace deserved the chance to know her father on whatever terms he was willing to actually show up for. Time moved forward the way it does, indifferent to how much you've been through, simply continuing whether you're ready or not. Grace grew from a furious newborn into a startlingly cheerful baby who laughed at almost anything, who reached for me the second I walked into a room, whose whole small existence felt, some days, like the clearest proof I had that walking away from that dinner table had been the right decision. I learned most of what happened to Brianna secondhand, in fragments passed along by my mother, who still ran into Diane's old neighbor at church occasionally, and later, more directly, from Patricia, who handled the civil suit over the fraudulent loan with the same brisk thoroughness she'd brought to my divorce. The court ordered Brianna to repay the full $41,000 plus interest in structured monthly installments she could barely afford on her salary as a part-time medical receptionist. Derek, true to what his attorney had hinted at during mediation, refused to quietly absorb the debt on her behalf the way he might have a year earlier, before he'd sat across a mediation table and watched, line by line, exactly how much his family had taken from me, without ever once considering it theft. He told her, according to my mother's secondhand account, that she needed to face what she'd actually done instead of assuming someone else would always clean it up for her. And that single sentence apparently caused a rift between brother and sister that hadn't fully healed by the time Grace turned 6 months old. Diane, for her part, seemed to split her loyalty right down the middle, defending Brianna publicly while, according to the same secondhand grapevine, privately telling relatives that she'd warned Brianna for years about pushing things too far. I found a strange, hollow satisfaction in hearing that. Not joy exactly, but the quiet vindication of watching a family that had spent years insisting I was the problem finally be forced to reckon with the actual math of who had been taking and who had been giving. I heard, too, that Brianna had to sell the car she'd bought with the stolen loan money to make a dent in her court-ordered payments, and that she'd moved out of the apartment she'd been renting into a smaller one, and that Caleb had transferred out of his private school into the local public school district, a change that apparently caused Diane no small amount of distress at family gatherings, though I wasn't there to witness any of it firsthand, and honestly, I felt no particular urge to be. I want to be honest and say that some small, unkind part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction hearing all of this. I'm not proud of that feeling, but I'm not going to pretend it wasn't there either. Mostly, though, what I felt was something closer to relief. Relief that the consequences of what had happened were finally landing where they belonged, instead of quietly, invisibly, landing on me the way they always had before. About 8 months after Grace was born, a letter arrived at my parents' address in Diane's careful, looping handwriting, forwarded from an old address Derek must have given her. I almost didn't open it. I sat with it unopened on the kitchen counter for 2 full days, Grace babbling in her high chair nearby, before curiosity finally won out over caution. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, though I think Diane believed it was one. She wrote about how difficult it had been raising 2 children largely on her own after her husband, Derek's father, had passed when Derek was only 12. How she'd always felt responsible for holding what was left of her family together. How Brianna's divorce and job loss had frightened her in ways she'd never fully explained to anyone. How sometimes fear made people cling too hard to the people they loved, even in ways that hurt other people who didn't deserve it. She said she hoped, someday, to be allowed to know her granddaughter. She said she understood if that day was a long way off, or never came at all. She signed it, simply, Diane, without any of the warmth she'd have used if she were writing to someone she felt entitled to. I read it 3 times before I set it back down on the counter. I didn't reply right away. I sat with it for almost 2 weeks, turning it over in my mind during quiet moments at the shop, during Grace's naps, during long drives to visit Patricia's office for the final paperwork on the civil suit. Eventually, I wrote back a short letter of my own. I told Diane I appreciated her honesty and that I understood, in an abstract way, how fear could curdle into behavior that hurt people even without meaning it maliciously. But I also told her, as gently and as clearly as I could manage, that understanding where cruelty comes from doesn't obligate anyone to keep absorbing it. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with Grace someday, it would have to be built slowly, on terms that protected my daughter first, and that it would take time, real time, not a single letter's worth of explanation, for me to trust that Diane had actually changed, rather than simply regretting the consequences of not changing sooner. She wrote back once more, a shorter note, thanking me for my honesty and saying she understood, and asking only that I let her know, someday, if I ever felt ready. I put that letter in a drawer, not out of anger, but because I genuinely didn't know yet what I'd decide, and some decisions, I'd learned, are better left to arrive in their own time rather than being forced. The message from Brianna came almost a year to the day after that dinner table. A single line asking if I'd be willing to meet, no explanation attached. I stared at it for a long time before I answered, half expecting it to be some kind of trap, some new angle I hadn't anticipated yet. But something in the flatness of the message, no manipulation dressed up as vulnerability, no dramatic flourish, made me curious enough to say yes. We met at a small coffee shop near the old apartment, a place I hadn't set foot in since I'd left New York. She was already there when I arrived, sitting near the window, and I almost didn't recognize her at first. Her face was thinner, tired in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or lighting, and something in the way she held herself, smaller, less certain, was so different from the woman who'd sneered at me across a dinner table that it took me a second to fully register it was actually her. "I was wrong," she said, almost before I'd even sat down. No preamble, no defensive framing. "About all of it. The loan, the things I said about you for years, blaming you for things that weren't your fault because it was easier than looking at my own life." I didn't feel the surge of vindication I might have expected. I just felt tired, in a quiet, distant way, like hearing an old argument settled long after it stopped mattering. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," she continued, twisting her coffee cup slowly between her hands. "I just needed to say it out loud to you directly. For my own sake, I think, more than yours." "That's fair," I said. "It's good that you understand it now." She looked up at me, something almost startled in her expression. "You don't hate me?" I thought about that honestly before answering, because I owed her, if nothing else, an honest answer instead of a performed one. "I did, for a long time," I said. "Right now, mostly I'm just busy. Grace, the business, my own life. There isn't a lot of room left over for hating you." She nodded slowly, studying me for a long moment. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for," she said finally. I didn't say anything to that because I didn't need her validation the way some earlier version of myself might have. I finished my coffee. We talked briefly and carefully about nothing much: Caleb's new school, my business, the weather, and then I left, walking out into the cold afternoon air feeling lighter than I expected, not because the conversation had fixed anything, but because I'd finally closed a door I'd been leaving unconsciously ajar for a year without realizing it. I picked Grace up from my mother's that evening, and when she saw me, she broke into the enormous gap-toothed grin she saved specifically for me, arms already reaching. I scooped her up and held her close, breathing in the particular warm smell of her hair. "It's all over now, sweet girl," I whispered against her head. And for the first time since that dinner table a year ago, I fully believed it. I want to go back for a moment, because I don't think I can tell the rest of this story honestly without slowing down to talk about Owen. And I've realized, looking back at everything I've written so far, that I kept rushing past him the way I used to rush past good things in general, half convinced, somewhere underneath, that they wouldn't stay long enough to be worth slowing down for. Owen and I had known each other, in the loose, distant way you know people from childhood, since before either of us could really remember. He was 2 years ahead of me in school, the kind of quiet, steady kid who never showed up in anyone's dramatic stories because he simply didn't create drama. And by the time I left for New York at 26, he was already running his father's small produce distribution business out near Rhinebeck, delivering vegetables to farm stands and small restaurants across 3 counties, unmarried, unremarkable in the specific way that, looking back now, I understand was actually its own quiet kind of remarkable. When I came home pregnant and shattered, Owen didn't rush anything. He showed up the way he showed up for everything, reliably, without fanfare, offering exactly what was needed and nothing more. A produce contract for the shop, a folding table, an extra pair of hands unloading delivery boxes. For months, I genuinely didn't think of him as anything other than a kind, steady presence in a life that badly needed steady presences. And I think, in hindsight, that was exactly right for that stretch of time. I wasn't ready for anything else. I don't think I could have recognized anything else, even if it had been standing directly in front of me. The shift happened slowly enough that I couldn't point to a single moment it started. I noticed I looked forward to his deliveries more than the produce itself warranted. I noticed I told him things I hadn't told anyone else. Not the big, dramatic things. Those I'd already told my parents and Patricia, and eventually Brianna and Diane in my own careful way. But the small things. The shape of my actual daily life. How Grace had started grabbing for my face during feedings. How the third week of a Vermont cold snap had frozen the pipes at the shop, and I'd cried in the walk-in cooler for reasons that had nothing to do with pipes. How some nights I lay awake replaying the dinner table. Not out of grief anymore, exactly, but out of a strange, clinical curiosity about the woman I used to be. Like studying an old photograph of yourself and not quite recognizing the person in it. He never pushed. That was the thing about Owen that took me the longest to trust, because I'd spent 8 years with a man who never pushed either. In a completely different way, Derek's silences had always been a kind of absence, a checking out, a refusal to engage that left me to fill the space myself. Owen's quiet was the opposite. It was presence, not absence. He listened like listening cost him something valuable, and he was glad to spend it on me. The turning point, if I had to name one, came about 10 months after Grace was born, on an evening when the shop's ancient walk-in refrigerator finally died completely, right in the middle of a large catering order for a wedding I couldn't afford to fail. Owen showed up within 20 minutes of my panicked call, no questions asked, driving his own refrigerated delivery truck across town so we could transfer everything perishable before it spoiled, working alongside me until nearly midnight in the cold dark of the parking lot behind the shop, both of us laughing, at some point, at the sheer absurdity of 2 grown adults hauling trays of stuffed mushrooms through a January parking lot at 11 at night. When it was finally done, we sat on the open tailgate of his truck, breath fogging in the cold, and he handed me a thermos of coffee he'd apparently thought to bring along without my asking. "You didn't have to do all this," I told him. "I wanted to," he said simply. Then, after a pause, quieter, "I think I've wanted to do a lot of things for you for a while now, Naomi. I just didn't want to be one more person rushing you into something before you were ready." I looked at him for a long moment in the truck's dim interior light. This steady, patient man who'd spent almost a year showing up without asking for anything in return. And I felt something in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel in a very long time. Not the breathless, consuming rush I remembered from falling for Derek at 22, but something quieter and, I was starting to understand, considerably more trustworthy. "I might be ready now," I said. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need to announce itself, and reached over to take my hand, cold and coffee-warmed at the same time. And we sat there on the tailgate of a produce truck in a nearly empty parking lot. 2 people who'd known each other their whole lives, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. By the time Grace turned 1, Heart Table had outgrown the small space above the hardware store in every meaningful way. What had started as a one-woman operation filling occasional catering orders and a handful of weekly meal subscriptions had, through a slow, steady accumulation of word-of-mouth referrals and a surprisingly effective local Instagram account my old college roommate had insisted on setting up for me, become something closer to a genuine small business, with a waiting list for weekend catering slots and a part-time staff of 3. I hired my first employee, a recently widowed woman named Carol Fenwick, no relation to anyone in my old life despite the coincidence of the name, who'd raised 4 children and could apparently debone a chicken faster than I could unlock my phone. I hired a high schooler named Priya to help with deliveries after classes, saving carefully for college the way I remembered saving for New York a lifetime ago, back before I understood how expensive certain kinds of leaving could actually be. Owen's produce contract expanded alongside the shop's growth, though by then our relationship had evolved well past anything that could be explained by professional necessity. He never made a show of the fact that half his deliveries came with an extra crate of something he thought I'd like, or that he'd started showing up early on Sunday mornings, specifically to help Priya load the delivery van so I could have an extra hour of sleep with Grace. There was a particular Tuesday in early autumn, about 14 months after that dinner table in Murray Hill, when I stood behind the counter watching Carol expertly plate an order of the honey-glazed chicken thighs I'd once made obsessively for a nephew who never once said thank you. I'd put the recipe on the menu deliberately, reclaiming it, I suppose, the same way I'd reclaimed my maiden name for the shop's sign. And I felt something settle in me that I can only describe as arrival. Not the arrival of having achieved some final, fixed state of happiness, because I don't think life actually offers that to anyone, but the arrival of finally standing somewhere solid, built with my own hands, that no one could take from me. At a dinner table with a single careless sentence. I thought, standing there, about the woman I'd been 14 months earlier, silent at that table, absorbing insult after insult because she'd been trained to believe silence was the price of belonging. And I felt, more than anything, a kind of tenderness toward her. The way you'd feel towards someone you'd once watched struggle without fully understanding until much later exactly how hard she'd actually been fighting. We threw Grace's first birthday party in the small backyard of my parents' house. String lights looped between the old maple trees, a cake my mother insisted on baking herself, despite my objections that I ran an entire catering business and could certainly handle one cake. Owen arrived early to help set up folding chairs, moving through my parents' backyard with an easy familiarity that made my chest ache in the good way. The way that reminds you certain kinds of belonging can be rebuilt, even after you thought you'd lost the capacity for them entirely. I'd invited Diane, cautiously, as a kind of trial. Not the whole family, not Brianna, just Diane, alone, with clear expectations laid out in advance about what the visit could and couldn't include. She arrived nervous in a way I'd genuinely never seen from her before, carrying a small, carefully wrapped gift and an expression that looked almost apologetic before she'd said a single word. She was careful the whole afternoon, almost painfully so, hanging back near the edge of the gathering, speaking softly, waiting to be invited into conversations rather than dominating them the way she used to. When Grace, wobbling on her new legs, made her way over to where Diane sat and held up a fistful of grass in offering the way toddlers do, Diane's whole face transformed, something genuinely soft and unguarded moving across it as she took the offered grass with exaggerated gratitude. "Thank you," she told my daughter, with a warmth I don't think I'd ever actually witnessed from her, directed at anyone, including her own children. I watched from across the yard, a slice of cake balanced on a paper plate in my hand, and felt something complicated settle in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something like the beginning of a bridge being built slowly, plank by careful plank, over a gap that might never fully close, but didn't necessarily have to stay as wide as it once was. Derek came by later that evening, after most of the guests had gone, staying only long enough to give Grace a small stuffed rabbit and to watch her take a few unsteady steps across the grass toward my father's outstretched hands. He and Owen shook hands, brief and civil, two men who understood, without needing to discuss it out loud, that they occupied entirely different roles in the same child's life, and that there was no reason those roles needed to be at war with each other. "She's happy," Derek said to me quietly as he was leaving, watching Grace shriek with delight as my father spun her gently in a circle. "You did good, Naomi. Better than I would have, probably." "We both did what we could with what we had," I told him, and I meant it without bitterness, which surprised me more than it probably should have. I don't think I gave my parents enough credit in the earliest chapters of this story for exactly what they did for me that year, and I want to correct that now. Because looking back, I understand that whatever strength I found in myself during that period, I found it standing on ground they'd spent decades quietly preparing for me, long before I ever knew I'd need it. My mother had worked as a school secretary for 31 years before retiring, the kind of job that requires infinite patience and very little recognition, the kind of job that teaches you, whether you want the lesson or not, how to keep a household running smoothly around chaos that isn't yours to control. My father had spent his career as a union electrician. Steady hours, steady paycheck. The kind of steadiness that never made headlines, but that had allowed them to raise me in a house that was always, without exception, warm and full and paid for. They'd never had much patience for Derek. Not because he'd ever done anything overtly offensive in their presence, but because of something quieter. Something my mother told me much later she'd noticed within the first hour of meeting him. The way he'd let his own mother finish sentences for me at that first dinner, years earlier, before we'd even gotten engaged, without once stepping in. I almost said something that night, my mother admitted to me once, months after I'd moved home, both of us shelling peas at the kitchen table in a ritual that had become almost sacred to me by then. But you were so happy, and I didn't want to be the mother who couldn't be happy for her own daughter. I've regretted that more than almost anything. You couldn't have stopped me from marrying him, Mom, I told her honestly. I wouldn't have listened. I had to learn it myself. She nodded slowly, accepting that, though I could tell some part of her still carried the weight of not having tried harder. I understood that weight, in a way, because I imagined I'd carry a version of it myself someday, watching Grace make her own choices, some of them undoubtedly ones I'd want to steer her away from and wouldn't be able to. My father, for his part, never once said I told you so. Not in 8 months of me living back under his roof. Not even in the smallest, most passive-aggressive way certain fathers might have allowed themselves. Instead, he simply showed up, every single day, in the unglamorous, undramatic ways that I came to understand, slowly, were actually the deepest form of love he knew how to offer. Fixing the leaking faucet in my old bathroom without being asked. Teaching himself at 61 years old how to properly hold a newborn because he refused to be the grandfather who was too nervous to help. Driving me to countless appointments and business meetings without ever once complaining about the gas money or the time. There is a particular memory I return to often, from around the time Grace was 4 months old. I'd had a hard day at the shop, a catering order gone wrong, a supplier who'd shorted us on an ingredient at the worst possible moment, and I came home late and exhausted to find my father sitting on the porch in the dark, waiting up, not for any particular reason he could articulate, just waiting, the way he used to when I was 17 and out past curfew. "Rough day?" he asked as I climbed the porch steps. "Rough day," I confirmed, sinking into the chair beside him. He didn't ask for details. He just sat with me in the dark for a while, the crickets loud in the yard, and eventually said, "You know, your mother and I are prouder of you right now than we've ever been. Not because of the shop, though that's impressive too. Because of how you handled all of it. The marriage, the papers, all of it. You didn't let it break you." I didn't trust myself to answer that without crying. So I just reached over and squeezed his hand, and we sat there together on the porch until the crickets finally quieted down and it was time to go inside. The last piece of the legal aftermath resolved itself almost 18 months after that dinner table, when Patricia called to let me know Brianna had made her final court-ordered payment on the fraudulent loan, closing out the civil suit entirely. I felt, hearing the news, a strange kind of anticlimax, I'd expected some larger emotional release, and instead, I mostly just felt a quiet sense of a door finally, fully closing. "How does it feel?" Patricia asked me on the phone, and I could hear the genuine curiosity in her voice, the professional satisfaction of a lawyer who'd fought hard for a client and wanted to know the fight had actually meant something on the other side of the paperwork. "Honestly," I said, "it feels smaller than I expected, like closing out a library book I forgot I still had checked out." Patricia laughed at that, a real laugh. "That's usually a good sign," she said. "The big emotional releases tend to happen earlier, in the middle of the fight, when you're still scared you might lose. By the time it's actually over, most of the healing's already been done somewhere along the way." I thought about that for a long time after we hung up, standing in the small office behind the shop where I did the bookkeeping most evenings after closing. Grace asleep in her portable crib in the corner, Owen finishing up a delivery run outside. Patricia was right, I realized. The healing hadn't happened in a single dramatic moment. It had happened in the accumulation of small, unglamorous choices: canceling an auto pay, packing a suitcase, pulling a credit report, painting a sign with my father, holding my daughter for the first time, sitting on the tailgate of a produce truck in a cold parking lot. None of those moments, individually, had felt like healing while I was living through them. They'd mostly just felt like survival. It was only looking back, from this particular distance, that I could see they'd been the same thing all along. Derek's final child support arrangement had been settled months earlier, calculated fairly according to state guidelines, and he'd been reliable about it, I'll give him that. Never late, never requiring a reminder. A small but real sign of the effort he was making to be a different kind of man than the one who'd said the word annulment across a dinner table like he was dusting lint off his shoulder. He visited Grace regularly, always calling ahead, always respectful of the boundaries I'd set, and slowly, cautiously, something like a functional co-parenting relationship had built itself between us. Not warm exactly, but steady, which was more than I'd expected, and considerably more than I'd once thought I deserved to hope for. I want to tell this part honestly, because it would be easy to end the story at the coffee shop, at the moment Brianna said she was wrong and I said it was enough, and let everyone believe that was the last complicated thing that ever passed between us. It wasn't. About 2 years after that dinner table, with Heart Table doing well enough that I'd started looking seriously at a second, larger location closer to the county's growing downtown corridor, Brianna reached out again. This time, it wasn't an apology. It was a request. She'd lost her receptionist job. Cutbacks, she said, though I never fully verified the details and didn't feel any particular obligation to. And she was struggling, genuinely struggling, to keep up with rent on the smaller apartment she'd moved into after selling the car. She asked, carefully, almost humbly, whether I might have any part-time work available at the shop. Front counter, deliveries, anything. I sat with that request for several days before responding, turning it over from every angle I could think of. Part of me, the part still healing from years of being quietly exploited by this exact woman, wanted to say no immediately. Wanted to protect the one thing I'd built entirely without her family's help from any possibility of her getting a foothold in it again. But another part of me, a part I'd worked hard over 2 years to cultivate, wanted to at least consider the request honestly, on its own terms, rather than purely through the lens of old grievances. I talked it over with Owen one evening, sitting on our porch. We'd moved in together by then. A small house just outside town with a garden my mother had helped me plant. And with Patricia, whose professional opinion I still valued even on matters that had nothing to do with legal strategy. "You don't owe her anything," Patricia told me plainly. "But that doesn't mean you're obligated to refuse just to prove a point either. The question isn't what she deserves, it's what actually protects you and the business." In the end, I decided against hiring her, but not out of spite. I told her, in a careful, honest phone call, that I didn't think it would be healthy for either of us to have a working relationship layered on top of everything else between us. That the boundary wasn't about punishment, but about protecting something fragile and hard-won that I wasn't willing to risk. I offered instead to write her a genuine letter of recommendation for other positions, based honestly on the parts of her I did know to be capable. She'd always been sharp, quick with people, good at organizing chaos when she wanted to be. And I gave her the name of a friend who managed a busy medical office 2 towns over and was looking for front desk help. She was quiet on the phone for a long moment. "That's fair," she finally said. "More than fair, honestly." She got the job at the medical office a few weeks later, and to my genuine surprise, she kept it, and kept it well, according to the occasional update that filtered back to me through my mother's church grapevine. I don't know if 2 years of consequences had actually changed something fundamental in her, or if she'd simply run out of people willing to catch her when she fell, and had finally learned, out of necessity, to catch herself. I didn't need to know which it was. I'd learned, by then, that I didn't have to solve the mystery of other people's growth in order to protect my own. Owen asked me to marry him on an ordinary Thursday evening in late September, almost exactly 3 years after that dinner table in Murray Hill, and true to his nature, there was nothing elaborate about it. No restaurant, no orchestrated surprise, no audience gathered to witness the moment. We were sitting on the porch of the small house we'd bought together the year before. Grace, 3 years old by then and endlessly talkative, running circles around the yard chasing fireflies in the last of the summer light. He didn't kneel. He just reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small ring box, and set it on the arm of my chair without ceremony, the way he might have handed me a set of keys. "I've been carrying this around for about a month, trying to find the right moment," he admitted, a little sheepish. "Turns out there isn't really a right moment. There's just this one, and it's good enough." I looked at him, this steady, patient man who'd spent 3 years showing up without ever once demanding I move faster than I was ready to move. And I felt none of the breathless panic I remembered from Derek's proposal years earlier. The sense of being swept somewhere I hadn't fully decided to go. I just felt certain, quiet, and complete. "Yes," I said. "Obviously, yes." Grace, catching some fraction of the moment's significance without understanding the details, ran over, demanding to know what was happening. And when we told her, in the simplified terms a 3-year-old could hold on to, that Owen was going to be her stepdad officially now, she considered this information with enormous seriousness before declaring that this meant he had to let her ride on his shoulders every single day for the rest of forever, a term Owen agreed to without hesitation. We were married the following spring, a small ceremony in my parents' backyard, under the same maple trees strung with lights from Grace's first birthday party. No more than 40 guests, most of them people who'd actually shown up for me during the hardest year of my life, rather than people who'd simply expected an invitation out of social obligation. My father walked me down a short grass aisle my mother had lined with mason jars full of wildflowers. Patricia came and cried more openly than I expected during the vows. Priya, now a college sophomore, served as an usher, beaming the whole ceremony. Even Diane came, seated quietly toward the back, her presence no longer a fraught negotiation, but simply an accepted, careful part of the ongoing, imperfect bridge we'd continued building between us over the years. Derek did not attend, which felt correct to both of us without needing to be discussed at length. He sent Grace flowers to give me instead, along with a short, genuinely kind note wishing me happiness, and I found, reading it, that I could receive the gesture warmly, without any of the old, complicated weight attached to it. I think it's worth pausing here, before I get to how the story actually ends, to talk honestly about what it felt like to marry again after everything that had happened. Because I know from the version of myself who sat at that dinner table 3 years earlier that the easy narrative, girl gets hurt, girl heals, girl finds a good man, the end, leaves out most of the actual texture of what healing costs and what it doesn't erase. I want to be clear that marrying Owen didn't undo what happened with Derek. I didn't walk into that backyard ceremony a blank slate, healed into forgetting. I walked in as a woman who still, on certain hard nights, dreamed about that dinner table, about Brianna's laugh, about the specific cold way Derek had looked at me right before he said the word annulment, like it cost him nothing. I walked in as a woman who still occasionally flinched, in the first months of living with Owen, when he raised his voice even slightly during an argument about something as small as whose turn it was to do the dishes, some old, exhausted part of me bracing automatically for an attack that never actually came, because Owen simply wasn't a man who attacked. It took real, deliberate work to unlearn some of what 8 years with Derek's family had trained into me. I started seeing a therapist in the second year after the divorce, a woman named Dr. An Pham who worked out of a small practice above a bakery in town. And much of our early work together wasn't about Derek or Brianna specifically at all. It was about the slower, quieter question of why I'd spent 8 years believing that love required silence, that being valued meant making myself small and useful and never inconvenient. You weren't just married to a man who let his family mistreat you, Dr. Pham told me once, in a session I still think about often. You were married to a belief system that told you your worth was measured by how much you could absorb without complaint. Leaving Derek was one decision. Unlearning that belief is going to take a lot longer, and it's going to keep showing up in unexpected places, including your relationship with Owen, even though Owen has done nothing to deserve your old defenses. She was right, of course. There were nights in that first year with Owen when I found myself apologizing reflexively for things that needed no apology, quietly clearing my schedule to accommodate something he hadn't even asked me to accommodate, watching myself do it with a strange, detached awareness, like observing an old habit I thought I'd already broken resurface out of nowhere. Owen, to his enormous credit, never once used those moments against me. Never once said, "Don't be so dramatic," or "You're overreacting," the way Derek's family so often had. He'd just gently pointed out, "You don't need to apologize for that, Naomi. I wasn't upset." And over time, slowly, those reflexes started to loosen their grip. I share all of this not to dampen the happier parts of this story, but because I think stories like mine too often get flattened into simple morality tales. Bad marriage, brave exit, happy ending. When the truth is messier, and, I think, more useful to anyone reading this who's still somewhere in the middle of their own version of it. Healing isn't a door you walk through once. It's a house you have to keep tending, room by room, for years, sometimes for the rest of your life. I'm not fully finished tending mine. I don't think I ever fully will be, but I've gotten considerably better at recognizing which rooms still need work, and I no longer mistake the work itself for failure. Heart Table's second location opened 2 years into my marriage to Owen, in the small but growing downtown corridor about 15 minutes from the original shop. A space nearly 3 times the size, with actual seating for customers who wanted to eat in rather than order for pickup or delivery. I'd hesitated for almost a year before committing to the expansion, running the numbers obsessively with Patricia's husband, an accountant who'd become an informal advisor to the business somewhere along the way, terrified of overextending myself the way I'd once watched a certain family overextend a marriage built on assumptions no one had ever bothered to examine. Carol Fenwick, my first employee, became the general manager of the original location, running it with the same brisk efficiency she'd brought from day one. Priya, now graduated from college with a degree in business, she credited, with more generosity than I probably deserved, to her years working front counter at Heart Table, watching me build something from nothing. Came on as a full-time operations manager, overseeing both locations with an energy and competence that made me feel, on my better days, almost unnecessary, which I understood to be a genuine mark of success, rather than a threat to my ego. The second location's opening night drew a crowd large enough that we ran out of the honey-glazed chicken thighs, still on the menu, still the shop's most requested item, still, in my own private accounting, a small, quiet act of reclamation every time someone ordered it, within the first 90 minutes. My parents worked the room like proud grandparents at a wedding, my father shaking hands with half the town, my mother pressing extra rolls into the hands of anyone who looked even slightly underfed. Owen manned the register for part of the evening, competent and calm, the way he was about everything, occasionally catching my eye across the crowded room with a small, private smile that said, without needing words, "Look what you built." Grace, 5 years old by then, spent most of the opening night perched on a stool behind the counter, self-appointed chief taste tester, offering unsolicited and enthusiastically delivered opinions on every dish that passed within her reach. At one point, a local reporter doing a small feature on the shop's expansion crouched down to ask her what she thought of her mother's cooking. And Grace, with the total unself-conscious confidence only a 5-year-old can summon, declared, "My mom makes the best chicken in the whole world, and she built this all by herself, and someday I'm going to help her run it." I had to step into the back hallway for a minute after that. Not because I was upset, but because something about hearing my daughter describe me, built this all by herself, in a voice so certain and so proud, undid something in me that I hadn't known was still waiting to be undone. I stood there for a moment, with my hand pressed against my mouth, and Owen found me a minute later, not saying anything, just wrapping his arms around me from behind and resting his chin on top of my head, until I was ready to go back out and rejoin the celebration. We had a daughter of our own, Owen and I, about a year after the second location opened, a decision we came to slowly and deliberately, the way we came to most decisions together, talking it through on the porch over the course of several months before either of us fully committed to it out loud. I was 34 by then, older than I'd expected to be having a second child, and the pregnancy was harder on my body than Grace's had been, longer, more tiring, punctuated by a scare in the second trimester that sent me to the hospital for 2 frightening days of monitoring before the doctors reassured us everything had stabilized. I remember lying in that hospital bed during those 2 days, Owen asleep uncomfortably in the chair beside me because he'd refused to go home despite my insistence that he should, and thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even in the middle of genuine fear, how different this felt from the fear I'd carried during my pregnancy with Grace. That fear had been solitary, wrapped up in a marriage that offered no real shelter, carried mostly alone even while surrounded by people. This fear, sitting in that hospital room, was shared completely, held jointly by two people who'd built their life together specifically so that neither of them would ever have to carry hard things by themselves again. We named her Eleanor, after Owen's grandmother, a small, fierce woman I'd met only twice before she passed, but had liked enormously both times. Grace, 6 years old by then and thoroughly invested in her new role as older sister, took to it with the same ferocious enthusiasm she brought to everything, appointing herself Eleanor's official protector within about 10 minutes of meeting her, a role she has, to this day, taken with total seriousness. Derek met Eleanor at one of his regular visits with Grace, holding her carefully for a few minutes in the living room of the house Owen and I shared, an expression on his face that was hard to fully read, something like tenderness, mixed with something that might have been a quiet, private grief for a version of a full family he'd once had the chance to build and hadn't. He never said anything about it directly, and I never asked, because by then, whatever remained between Derek and me had settled into something businesslike and civil enough that I didn't feel the need to excavate his private feelings on my behalf. "She's beautiful," was all he said, handing Eleanor gently back to me. "You've built a really good life, Naomi. I'm glad. I mean that." "I know you do," I told him, and I did know it by then, in a way that no longer required any particular emotional effort to believe. There's a conversation I had with Grace when she was 7, one that I've thought about often in the years since, one that I think, more than any court settlement or business milestone, actually marked the real end of this story for me. The true final chapter of everything that started at that dinner table. She'd come home from a weekend visit with Derek, full of the particular chatter kids bring home from time spent with the parent they see less often. And somewhere in the middle of describing the museum they'd visited and the pizza they'd eaten, she paused and asked, with the sudden, disarming directness only children manage, "Mom, why don't you and Dad live together like Kayla's mom and dad do?" I sat down across from her at the kitchen table, considering carefully how much truth a 7-year-old could actually hold, and decided, in the end, on more truth than less, delivered gently. "Your dad and I got married when we were younger," I told her. "For a long time, things were good between us. But over time, some people in his family started treating me unfairly, and your dad didn't stand up for me the way a husband should have. By the time I found out I was pregnant with you, things had gotten hard enough between us that we both realized we'd be happier, and you'd be better cared for, if we weren't married anymore." Grace considered this with the same total seriousness she brought to everything. "Was it my fault?" she asked in a small voice that broke my heart a little. "Not even a little bit," I told her immediately, taking both her hands in mine. "It was never about you, sweet girl. You were actually the very best thing that happened during that whole hard time. Finding out you were coming is what finally gave me the courage to leave a situation that wasn't good for me anymore. You didn't cause any of it. If anything, you're the reason I found the strength to fix it." She thought about that for a long moment, her small face working through it with visible effort, and then she said something that stopped me completely, something I don't think I'll ever fully stop turning over in my mind. "So you were brave," she said. Not a question, a conclusion. "I tried to be," I told her. "I'm going to be brave too," she said, with the total, uncomplicated confidence of a child who has grown up, without ever fully realizing it, in a household where bravery was simply the ordinary water everyone swam in, rather than some rare, difficult thing to be summoned only in crisis. I didn't cry in front of her, but I cried later that night, sitting on the porch with Owen, trying to explain why a simple sentence from a 7-year-old had undone me so completely. He didn't try to talk me out of the tears. He just sat with me, his arm around my shoulders, until I was ready to go back inside. I want to tell you about a strange, small moment that happened about 4 years after that dinner table, because I think it captures something about this whole story better than any of the bigger dramatic beats. The annulment petition, the fraud discovery, the mediation table ever could. I was cleaning out a storage closet at the original Heart Table location, sorting through old boxes we'd never fully unpacked from the move, when I found a small cardboard box I didn't immediately recognize. Inside, wrapped carelessly in an old sweater, were a handful of things I'd apparently packed in that frantic 11 minutes the night I left Murray Hill and never fully unpacked since. A stack of unused wedding thank you cards, a photo from our honeymoon in a frame with a small crack in the glass, and, at the very bottom, the small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother. I sat down on an overturned crate in that dusty storage closet and opened the jewelry box. And inside, exactly where I'd left it years earlier, was a folded piece of paper I'd forgotten entirely about. A note I'd apparently written to myself sometime during the first year of my marriage, in the loopy, uncertain handwriting of a woman still very much finding her footing. I don't remember writing it. I don't remember what prompted it, but there it was, dated almost a full year before that final dinner. 4 sentences in blue ink that I read standing in a storage closet with my hands shaking slightly. I don't know if I'm imagining this or if things are actually getting harder here. I keep telling myself it will get better once Brianna gets back on her feet. I keep telling myself I'm the one being difficult. I hope future me knows better than I do right now. I sat with that note for a long time, tears running freely down my face in a dusty storage closet surrounded by boxes of extra napkins and disposable containers, grieving, in a strange, delayed way, for the woman who'd written those 4 uncertain sentences and then spent 6 more years convincing herself she was the problem. 6 more years absorbing insult after insult at a dinner table because she'd been trained to believe that was the price of belonging to a family. I wanted, more than almost anything I've ever wanted, to be able to reach back through time and tell that woman what I knew now, that she wasn't imagining it, that things weren't going to get better once Brianna got back on her feet, because Brianna's feet were never actually the problem, that the difficulty she felt wasn't a personal failing, but an accurate read of a genuinely unhealthy situation she had every right to leave far sooner than she eventually did. I couldn't do that, of course. Nobody gets to reach back and rescue their younger self from the specific years it took to learn a hard lesson the hard way. But I folded the note carefully, put it back in the jewelry box, and drove home that evening thinking about how future me had, in fact, eventually known better, even if it took considerably longer than either version of myself would have liked. I showed the note to Owen that night, sitting at our kitchen table after the girls were asleep, and he read it twice, quietly, before setting it down. "I wish I could have met you back then," he said finally. "Not to change anything. I don't think it would have been my place. I just wish I could have told her it wasn't going to stay like that forever." "I think some part of her already suspected that," I said, thinking of the note itself, the desperate hope buried in that last sentence. She just needed proof. I've thought a great deal in the years since that dinner table about what actually went wrong in that marriage. And I've come to believe it wasn't any single dramatic betrayal, not Brianna's fraud, not Derek's word annulment tossed out across a table like an insult, not even Diane's decades of quiet favoritism toward her own children over the woman who married into her family. Those were the visible wounds, the ones easy to point to, easy to build a legal case around. But underneath all of it was something quieter and, I think, more universally instructive. The slow, almost invisible way a person can be trained, one small silence at a time, to believe that their own needs are a burden other people are generously tolerating, rather than a legitimate part of any healthy relationship. I gave that family 8 years of quiet accommodation because somewhere along the way, maybe from watching my own upbringing, maybe from some cultural script about what a good wife looks like that I'd absorbed without ever consciously choosing it, I came to believe that patience was a virtue, regardless of who it was directed at. That enduring mistreatment silently was somehow nobler than naming it out loud. I know now that patience aimed at the wrong people doesn't build anything. It just teaches them that your limits are negotiable, that your silence can be relied upon indefinitely, that they can keep taking because you've never once shown them where the taking has to stop. I don't think Derek was ever a true villain, not in the cartoonish sense the word usually implies. I think he was a man who lacked the courage, for most of our marriage, to stand up to his own mother and sister on my behalf. And I've come to understand, watching him slowly become a more present and honest father to Grace over the years since, that cowardice and cruelty aren't always the same thing, even though they can produce remarkably similar damage when left unchecked long enough. He paid a real price for that cowardice. A marriage he lost, years of relationship with his daughter he can never fully get back, a sister whose consequences he eventually had to stop shielding her from. I don't know if he's fully reckoned with all of that even now. I no longer feel particularly invested in finding out. Brianna, I think, paid the steepest and most visible price of everyone, though I've come to believe her real punishment was never really the court-ordered repayment schedule, which she completed eventually without further incident. Her real punishment, if you can call consequences that, was having to finally exist in a life without someone else's money quietly cushioning every hard landing, having to build, slowly and without shortcuts, whatever stability she has now entirely through her own effort, the way the rest of us mostly have to. And me, what did I actually gain in the end, beyond a fair legal settlement and a business I'm proud of? I think what I gained, more than anything else, was the simple, foundational understanding that my worth was never actually contingent on how much I could silently absorb without complaint. That's not a lesson the law can grant you, no matter how skilled your attorney is. It's not a lesson a settlement check can fully purchase either, though I won't pretend the settlement didn't help enormously with the practical business of rebuilding a life. It's a lesson you have to actually live your way into, the hard way, one boundary at a time, one canceled auto pay at a time, one dinner table walked away from at a time, until eventually you look up and realize you've built an entire life that no longer requires you to make yourself smaller for anyone's comfort but your own occasional, ordinary need for peace and quiet. I think about that dinner table often, still, not with the raw pain I once felt, but with something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds. That table, and everyone sitting around it that night, gave me the exact push I needed to finally stop believing that love required disappearing. I wouldn't wish that particular lesson on anyone, but I'm no longer sorry I learned it. People ask me sometimes, now that Heart Table has a small local reputation and I occasionally get invited to speak to community groups about small business ownership, whether I have any advice for women who recognize pieces of themselves in this story. Women sitting, right now, at their own version of that dinner table, absorbing insults dressed up as concern, wondering if the discomfort they feel is a personal failing or an accurate warning they've been too afraid to listen to. I never quite know how to compress years of hard-won understanding into the kind of tidy advice people expect in those moments, But I've settled over time on a few things I actually believe, and I'll share them here for whoever might need them. The first is this: pay attention to what people do when they think no one's keeping score. Derek's family never openly announced that they viewed me as a resource to be used rather than a person to be valued. They simply behaved that way, consistently, for years, in 100 small, unremarked upon moments. The unpaid tuition, the unreturned loans, the casual assumption that my money and my time existed for their convenience. If I could go back, I'd tell my younger self to trust the pattern of behavior over any individual explanation offered for it, because patterns rarely lie the way explanations can. The second thing I'd say is that documentation isn't paranoia. I started keeping records of what I was paying for and what I was told well before I had any conscious plan to use them, simply because some quiet, self-protective instinct told me I might need proof someday that I wasn't the unreasonable one. I was right. If you find yourself doing something similar, saving screenshots, keeping receipts, noting dates, don't talk yourself out of it. That instinct is usually smarter and more honest than the part of you still hoping things will simply resolve themselves on their own. The third thing, and I think the hardest one to actually live, is that walking away from people who mistreat you doesn't require them to fully understand why, or to apologize adequately, or to ever really change. I got a version of an apology from Brianna eventually, and a slow, careful, still unfinished bridge with Diane, and I'm grateful for both of those things. But I want to be honest that I didn't wait for either of them before I let myself heal. I couldn't have. If I'd made my own peace contingent on their remorse arriving in exactly the right form, I might still be waiting. Peace, I've learned, mostly has to be something you build for yourself, on your own timeline, regardless of whether the people who hurt you ever fully reckon with what they did. And the last thing, the thing I try hardest to actually model for Grace and Eleanor as they grow, rather than just say out loud, is that leaving a bad situation isn't a failure of loyalty. For years, I believed that staying, no matter the cost to myself, was the measure of how good a wife, how good a daughter-in-law, how good a person I was. I understand now that loyalty owed to people who treat you as disposable isn't virtue. It's just a habit, dressed up to look like a virtue. And habits, unlike actual values, can be unlearned. We have our own dinner table now, Owen and I. A long farmhouse table my father built for us as a wedding gift, sturdy and a little uneven in a way that somehow makes it feel more solid rather than less. Sunday dinners have become a fixed ritual in our house, the way they never quite managed to be a genuine comfort in my first marriage, despite all the effort I poured into them. My parents come most weeks, my father still finding small, unnecessary repairs to make around our house every visit, my mother still arriving with a container of something she insists we don't actually need, but that always somehow disappears by the end of the meal. Grace, 8 now, sets the table with an efficiency that makes me smile every time, remembering my own younger self doing the exact same task in a much different kitchen for a much different audience. Eleanor, 3, mostly contributes by narrating the entire process loudly from her booster seat. Diane comes about once a month now, by mutual, unhurried agreement, always calling ahead, always bringing something small and thoughtful for the girls, always careful in a way that has, over the years, softened into something that no longer feels like careful performance and has started to feel like actual earned trust. We don't discuss Brianna much when she's over. Not out of avoidance exactly. just because there isn't a great deal left that needs saying about it anymore. Sometimes, setting that table on a Sunday afternoon, the smell of something roasting in the oven, Owen's low laugh carrying in from the porch where he's usually wrangling one of the girls into helping carry chairs, I think back to that other table in Murray Hill. The honey-glazed chicken, the volume of Brianna's phone, my mother-in-law's finger tracing an imaginary spot of dirt on a perfectly clean table. I don't think about it with pain anymore most days. I think about it the way you think about weather from a storm that's long since passed. Something that happened. Something that shaped the landscape in ways still visible if you know where to look, but no longer something with any power to actually touch you. The girl who stood in that narrow galley kitchen for 2 hours making a chicken dish for a nephew who never once said thank you, smelling oil she couldn't yet explain the nausea from, carrying a secret she was saving for a quiet moment that never came. I think about her often, with tenderness now instead of grief. I want her to know, if there's any way messages like that can actually travel backward through time to the people who need them, that the quiet math she started doing that night, canceling one bill after another with hands that were finally steady, was the first real act of building the life she actually deserved. It took a dinner table falling apart to teach me that. I wouldn't recommend the lesson to anyone, but I'm profoundly, permanently grateful I finally learned it. There's one more thing I want to include in this account, something I've never told anyone besides Owen, not even my mother. And I'm only including it now because I think it might matter to someone reading this who's still standing exactly where I once stood. About 6 months after I left Murray Hill, in the strange, quiet stretch of early pregnancy after I'd already hired Patricia, but before the mediation sessions had begun, I sat down one night at my parents' kitchen table and wrote Derek a long letter. Not the clipped, business-like texts we've been exchanging about tuition payments and legal deadlines. A real letter, 6 pages, everything I hadn't said across 8 years of marriage, every dinner I'd swallowed my own opinions to keep the peace. Every time his silence at that table had felt like a second, smaller betrayal, layered on top of whatever his mother or sister had just said. Every quiet resentment I'd talked myself out of feeling because feeling it seemed selfish, unwifely, ungrateful. I wrote about the boy who used to bring me warm bread rolls before exams, and the man he'd become somewhere along the way. And I tried in that letter to trace the exact path between the two, as if understanding the mechanism of how he'd changed might somehow make the change hurt less. I wrote for almost 2 hours, filling page after page in handwriting that got messier as the night went on. And by the time I finished, close to 1 a.m, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, like I'd finally set down something enormously heavy I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. I never sent it. I folded it, put it in an envelope, wrote his name on the front, and then set it in the drawer of my old childhood desk, where it stayed, unsent, through the entire divorce process, through Grace's birth, through the opening of the shop, through every subsequent chapter of my life until, cleaning out that same desk years later to make room for Grace's own school supplies, I found it again, slightly yellowed, and read it one more time before finally, deliberately, burning it in the small fire pit in our backyard, watching the pages curl and blacken while Owen stood beside me, not asking questions, just present. I share this because I think there's a particular kind of pressure people feel, especially in stories like this one, to believe that real closure requires some final, decisive confrontation. The letter sent, the speech delivered, the villain forced to hear every carefully accumulated grievance read aloud. I want to say clearly that this isn't always true. Sometimes the most complete closure comes from writing the letter entirely for yourself, saying everything you need to say into a private, contained space, and then choosing, deliberately, not to hand that weight to someone who was never going to receive it the way it deserved to be received. Derek didn't need to read those 6 pages for them to do their work. I needed to write them. That was enough. I think, if I had to name the single moment that mattered most to my healing, more than the mediation table, more than the credit report revealing Brianna's fraud, more even than the coffee shop apology I'd once fantasized about receiving for years without daring to hope it would actually come, I think it would be a much smaller, quieter moment that happened in Patricia's office during our very first meeting, when I finally, fully told someone the whole story and watched her simply believe me. I don't think people who haven't lived through years of being quietly gaslit by a family understand how significant that moment can be. The moment someone with genuine authority and expertise looks at your situation and says, plainly, without hedging, without asking you to consider the other side's perspective one more time, that what happened to you was wrong. For 8 years, every time I'd tried to name what was happening at that dinner table, I'd been met with some version of, "Don't be so sensitive," or "You're taking it the wrong way," or "Think about how hard this is for everyone else," until I genuinely started to doubt my own perception of my own life. Sitting in that small office above the dry cleaner, watching Patricia's expression sharpen with real anger on my behalf as she read through the settlement Derek's attorney had drafted, I felt something in my chest unclench that had been clenched for so long I'd stopped noticing the tension as anything unusual. Being believed, fully and without qualification, turned out to be its own form of medicine, one I hadn't known I was starving for until I finally received a dose of it. I think about that often now, in the small kindnesses I try to extend to anyone who tells me a difficult story about their own life. A customer at the shop who mentions, almost in passing, some hard situation at home. A friend working through her own complicated marriage. I've learned that you don't always need to solve someone's problem to help them enormously. Sometimes you just need to believe them, plainly and without qualification, and let that belief do some of the healing work that 8 years of silence never could. Every year, on the date of that dinner, I do something small and private to mark it, a ritual I never planned deliberately, but that seems to have grown into itself over time. I don't tell many people about it, not out of secrecy exactly, just because it feels like it belongs to me alone, the way certain private rituals do. The first year, I marked it by driving past the old apartment building in Murray Hill, sitting in the car outside for a few minutes, not out of nostalgia, but out of a strange need to confirm to myself that the building was still just a building, brick and glass and nothing more, no longer holding any power over me simply by existing. The second year, I cooked the same dinner I'd made that night, the pot roast, the honey chicken, all of it. But this time for my parents and for Owen, in my own kitchen, on my own terms. And it tasted, I remember thinking, completely different, even though the recipe hadn't changed at all. The third year, I took the whole day off from the shop and spent it entirely with Grace, just the two of us, no agenda beyond being together. This past year, the 5th anniversary, I did something I hadn't done before. I sat down and wrote out this whole account, start to finish, the story you're reading now. Not for any particular publication or audience I had in mind when I started, just because I woke up that morning with a strong, sudden need to put the whole thing down on paper in order from the smell of hot oil in that narrow kitchen to the sound of Grace declaring, with total 7-year-old confidence, that she was going to be brave too. Writing it took longer than I expected and forced me to sit with parts of the story I usually keep tucked away in the back of my mind. Not because they still hurt, exactly, but because revisiting them takes a particular kind of energy I don't always have to spare. There were sections I had to step away from and come back to later, particularly the parts about the note I found in my grandmother's jewelry box. The 4 uncertain sentences from a woman who didn't yet know she was allowed to trust her own instincts. There were other sections that surprised me by how easily they came, how much lighter they felt to write than I'd expected. Particularly everything about Owen, about the shop, about the strange, steady accumulation of ordinary good days that eventually outweighed the extraordinary bad one. I think that's actually the most honest thing I can say about how this story ends, or rather, about how it continues, because I don't think stories like this one ever fully end in the way a novel ends, with all the loose threads deliberately tied off. Derek is still Grace's father, and always will be. Diane still comes to Sunday dinner about once a month, still careful, still, I believe, genuinely trying. Brianna still exists somewhere in the world, presumably still working her medical office job, presumably still, I hope, slowly building whatever stability she's capable of building on her own. None of them disappeared from my life entirely the way villains disappear at the end of a story once their narrative purpose is served. They just became smaller, further away, less capable of reaching in and disrupting the life I've built, which I've come to understand is really the most realistic version of a happy ending most of us actually get to have. If you're reading this and you recognize pieces of your own life in it, the dinner table where your opinions don't seem to matter, the family member who always shows up at exactly the wrong moment, the quiet, creeping suspicion that you've been trained to accept less than you deserve because naming the problem out loud feels more frightening than simply continuing to endure it. I want to say a few final things directly to you, the way I wish someone had said them to me, clearly and without hedging, sometime during those 8 years instead of only after everything had already fallen apart. You are allowed to keep records. You are allowed to notice patterns and trust what you notice, even when everyone around you insists you're imagining things or overreacting. You are allowed to stop paying for people who have never once, in any meaningful way, invested in you. You are allowed to leave a room, a dinner table, a marriage, without having a perfectly airtight case prepared in advance, though I'll admit, from my own experience, that having the case prepared certainly makes the leaving considerably easier to survive, financially and legally. You are allowed to grieve the version of your life you thought you were building, even while you're actively building a better one to replace it. Those two things aren't contradictory. I grieved my marriage to Derek for a long time, even as I was falling in love with Owen, even as Heart Table was growing into something I was genuinely proud of, even as Grace was growing into a bright, funny, resilient little girl who never once made me regret staying pregnant that night at the dinner table. Grief and growth happened simultaneously, layered over each other. And I think that's actually how it's supposed to work, however much certain tidy narratives about moving on might suggest otherwise. And finally, you are allowed to become someone your younger self wouldn't fully recognize. The woman who stood silently in that galley kitchen, absorbing insult after insult while she cooked chicken for a boy who never once thanked her, would probably be somewhat startled by the woman I am now. The one who cancels auto-pay transfers without her hands shaking, who owns 2 storefronts with her name quietly reclaimed on the sign. who sits across a mediation table without flinching, who tells her daughter, plainly and without hesitation, that leaving a bad situation was never a failure of loyalty. I don't think that transformation happened because I became a fundamentally different person. I think it happened because I finally stopped believing the story that family had spent years telling me about who I was allowed to be, and started, slowly, writing my own version instead. That dinner table in Murray Hill still exists somewhere, I imagine, in some form. Whoever lives in that apartment now probably eating their own dinners around it, entirely unaware of what once happened there. I don't think about it with anger anymore, most days. I think about it the way you think about the specific place where a long, difficult chapter of your life finally ended and a considerably better one began. Not fondly exactly, but with a strange, settled kind of respect for how much that one ordinary Tuesday evening ended up costing me, and how much more, in the years since, it ended up giving me back. Before I close this account, I want to mention a handful of small physical objects that have followed me through every version of this story, because I think the things we choose to keep, out of everything we could have left behind, tell their own quiet truth about who we're becoming. The wooden jewelry box from my grandmother sits on my dresser now, in the house I share with Owen and the girls, holding an entirely different collection of things than it once did. Grace's first lost tooth, a small pressed flower from our wedding, a tiny hospital bracelet from the day Eleanor was born. The note I found inside it years ago, those 4 uncertain sentences in looping blue ink, I copied into a journal before I ever framed the original for the small shelf above my desk at the shop, where I keep it not as a wound on display, but as a kind of marker, a reminder of exactly how far a person can travel between one dinner table and the next, given enough time and enough courage, and frankly, enough help from people who showed up when it mattered. I kept the small hand-painted sign my father made for the first Heart Table location, retired now to a place of honor on the wall of the second location's back office, Heart Table, in his careful, slightly uneven lettering, the small painted heart tucked into the corner of the T exactly as it always was. I kept the thermos Owen brought me that cold January night in the parking lot, still in regular rotation in our kitchen cabinet, a little dented now from years of daily use, filled most mornings with coffee I drink standing at the counter while the girls argue cheerfully over breakfast. I did not keep the wedding china from my first marriage, the good plates I'd set that final table with, hoping for one quiet evening that belonged only to Derek and me before everything fell apart. I donated that set, along with most of what I'd once considered my half of that apartment's belongings, to a local charity during the divorce proceedings, unable to imagine a version of my future where I'd want to eat off those particular plates again. I don't regret that decision. Some things aren't meant to be carried forward, no matter how nice they once looked on a shelf. And I kept, perhaps most importantly, the habit that started that difficult week. The habit of paying close attention to where my money and my time and my patience actually go, and asking myself, regularly and without flinching, whether the people receiving them have ever shown any real intention of reciprocating. It's a small, unglamorous habit, nothing like the dramatic act of walking out with a packed suitcase that people probably imagine when they picture the turning point of a story like this one. But it's the habit that's actually protected me, day after ordinary day in the years since. The quiet, continuous practice of noticing and naming, and, when necessary, simply stopping. I'll end with this because I think it captures, better than any single lesson I could try to spell out directly, exactly what this whole long story actually taught me. Last month, Diane came for Sunday dinner, as she does now most months, And somewhere in the middle of the meal, with Grace narrating an elaborate story about a school project involving volcanoes, and Eleanor methodically destroying a dinner roll with the intense concentration only a 3-year-old can bring to bread, Diane looked around the table, at Owen carving the chicken, at my father refilling everyone's water glasses without being asked, at my mother laughing at something Grace had said, at me, sitting at the head of a table I'd built entirely on my own terms. And she said, quietly, mostly to herself, "This is a good table, Naomi." I looked up at her, surprised by the simplicity of the comment, by how much it seemed to actually mean to her. "It is," I agreed. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask her to. I think we both understood, without needing to say it directly, exactly what she was comparing it to. Exactly which other table, years and a whole different life ago, this one stood in such clear, deliberate contrast against. I watched her for a moment longer. This woman who'd once told me, with icy precision, not to use my own pregnancy to manipulate her son, now sitting quietly at the edge of a table she'd been slowly, carefully, humbly welcomed back into. And I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, something that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite peace, but was, I think, close enough to both to finally let the whole long story rest. Grace finished her volcano story to enthusiastic applause from my father. Eleanor triumphantly declared her dinner roll fully destroyed. Owen caught my eye across the table and smiled, the same steady, undemanding smile he'd been offering me for years now, the one that had never once asked me to be smaller than I actually was. I thought, sitting there, about the girl who'd stood in a narrow galley kitchen years earlier, stirring a pot of gravy with hands she didn't yet know were about to start shaking, carrying a secret she was saving for a quiet evening that never came. I wished, the way I still sometimes wish, that I could reach back and tell her it was all going to turn out all right in the end. Better than all right, actually. Better than she would have dared to hope for, sitting at that other table, absorbing one more insult in silence because she'd been trained to believe silence was the price of belonging. I couldn't tell her that, of course. She had to find it out the hard way, the only way any of us really find out the things that matter most. But I could sit at this table instead, this good table, surrounded by people who'd actually earned their place at it, and let that be its own kind of answer. A few people who've heard fragments of this story over the years have asked why I'd want to write the whole thing down in such detail, especially the harder parts, the dinner table itself, the annulment papers, the discovery of the fraudulent loan, the long, unglamorous months of mediation. Wouldn't it be easier, they ask, to simply let the past stay in the past? To focus only on the good life I've built since, rather than dragging all of it back out into the light? I understand the instinct behind that question, but I don't actually agree with it, and I think the disagreement matters enough to explain. I spent 8 years of my life being told, in 100 small and large ways, that my experience of my own marriage wasn't reliable, that I was too sensitive, too transactional, too quick to keep score, too willing to make a simple family dinner into something dramatic. I internalized that story so completely that by the time Derek said the word annulment across that table, some small, exhausted part of me almost believed I deserved it, that I'd somehow brought it on myself by daring to say out loud that the money I'd spent was my own money. Writing this account, start to finish, in as much honest detail as I could manage, has been my way of finally, fully rejecting that old story. not by exaggerating what happened, and not by pretending the years since have been uniformly easy either. They haven't been. And I've tried to be honest about that too, about the therapy, about the reflexive apologies I still sometimes catch myself making, about the note I found in my grandmother's jewelry box that undid me all over again years after I thought I'd finished grieving that particular version of myself. I've tried instead simply to tell it the way it actually happened, in the order it actually happened, trusting that the truth, laid out plainly, would make its own case better than any argument I could construct on top of it. If you've read this far, whatever brought you here, I hope some part of this account has been useful to you, not as entertainment, though I understand stories like this one often get consumed that way, but as evidence, real and specific, that a table like the one I once sat at doesn't have to be the last table you ever sit at. There's always, I've come to believe, another table waiting somewhere down the road, one you get to build yourself on your own terms, surrounded by people who actually earned their place at it. I hope you find yours. I hope, if you're not there yet, that you find the courage to start looking, the way I finally did, 3 days after a man I once loved said a word he thought would erase me, and I simply, calmly, began canceling the bills. A year or two ago, a young woman who'd read an early, much shorter version of this account that I'd shared privately with a friend reached out to me through the shop's contact page. She didn't give many details, only that she recognized herself in the dinner table scene, in the specific, particular loneliness of being surrounded by in-laws and still somehow the only person at the table who felt invisible. She asked, hesitantly, how I'd actually found the nerve to say the words, "It's my own money," out loud, after years of never once contradicting anyone at that table. I thought about her question for several days before I answered, because I wanted to give her something more useful than a platitude. What I finally wrote back was this: I don't think the nerve came from any single source of courage I discovered that particular night. I think it came from the accumulation of every quiet moment in the preceding weeks where I'd started, almost without noticing, to trust myself again. The 10 days of a strange new nausea I didn't yet have words for. The sonogram appointment where a doctor spoke to me directly instead of through Derek. The walk home from that appointment when I cried alone on a New York sidewalk and realized no one needed to witness my joy for it to be real. By the time Brianna sneered at me across that table, some new, small reserve of self-trust had already quietly filled back up inside me. Enough that her contempt simply couldn't drain it the way it always had before. I told her that courage, in my experience, rarely arrives as a single dramatic surge. It usually arrives as a slow accumulation of small, private evidence that you're allowed to trust your own perception of your own life, gathered quietly, over time, often without your even realizing the reserve is building, until the moment it's finally, suddenly, enough. She wrote back a short note thanking me, and I never heard from her again after that, which I choose to take as a good sign rather than a worrying one. I think about her sometimes, whoever and wherever she is now, and I hope, whatever her own dinner table looked like, that she eventually found her way to a quieter one, the way I did. Not because the fight for it was easy, but because, in the end, it was worth every difficult step it took to get there.